This past Tuesday, I heard the shouts of our ancestors and witnessed the tears of martyrs who prayed, died, and fought for these United States to give life to the rhetoric she loves to recite, but grudgingly refused to live. I remember standing in 2008 among the throng of people, Reverend Stacy celebrating a moment in history down in Grant Park. History only a few in the crowd that time could claim to have worked truly to create. Those who were part of Generation X, Y, and the millennial generation could claim to have voted for the President of the United States. But others gathered in Grant Park could state that they had walked, marched, and were jailed to see this moment happen. There were those among us in the balcony of eternity who died fighting to make the White House more than a White House. I remember being at Grant Park, excited with Monica standing near the stage, hearing the President of the United States and speak. My eyes ablaze, my heart full of thanks. I was staring at the first family, a beautiful first family that had been nurtured and developed in a very special corner of Zion. No revisionist history, political tension can erase the truth and the reality of the fact that the black church, our oldest enduring institution, not a mosque, but the church, not a synagogue, but the church, not a secular humanist meeting, but a church on 95th Street, left an imprint somewhere on the corner of a soul of a man who would lead the most powerful nation on the planet. I remember vividly that day at Grant Park, where we hugged people we didn't even know, cried and shouted together, and moments of tears flowing from our eyes, and all of us were caught in the beauty of that moment. Another such moment came again this past Tuesday. Again, celebration went forth not only from this congregation, but across the land collectively, and celebrated the moment. But I like to say, as our brother from Trinity, Gary, from Trinity in Gary, Indiana, John Jackson stated that it's good to celebrate the moment, but never forget that this moment is connected to a larger movement. There is nothing wrong with moments of celebration, but do not develop spiritual amnesia to the movement that made the moment possible. President Obama, with all of his brilliance, the strategic cunning of David Plouffe, the political savvy of David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett, they are only supporting players in a larger drama, a movement created by the grace of God. A movement that began in 1619, when about 9 Africans landed upon these shores, not as human beings, but as chattel. Or Reverend Moses Dixon, many have never heard of, who had a larger slave revolt organized in Cincinnati, larger than Nat Turner or Gabriel Prosser. Or Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who stood in Buffalo, I believe in 1824, and told the people that they must revolt because they are enslaved by so-called Christians who are truly operating in demonic ways. Or even that Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, before James Cone knew anything about black theology, he already stood before the African Methodist Episcopal Church and said, God is a Negro. And Harriet Tubman, who had a Bible in one hand and a gun on the other hip, that said, you can either cross the Mississippi or you can cross the Jordan. It's your choice. I'm taking you to freedom. Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, the brilliance of Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, who had to hide in the back of a car because people were afraid that they would find out about his orientation when he was teaching about nonviolence. Or Stokely Carmichael, who became Kwame Ture. All of them, and that great prophet of peace by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I believe it was my father who told me this story that enthralled my spirit when he told me that Dr. King is the one who really elected more presidents than anybody else. He said it was in 1960 that Dr. King was sentenced to Reidsville Prison in Georgia because he had a traffic ticket. He was given 4 months hard labor, and they were transferring him to Reidsville Prison because they said he had violated his probation because he had participated in the student sit-in movement in Atlanta. And so as a result of that, President Kennedy called Coretta Scott King and then dispatched his brother, Robert Kennedy, who then called the judge, and they released Dr. King. And they held a rally at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And Dr. King's own father was a Nixon supporter, and he had a Nixon button on his suit. He took off the button and said, "This day I am a Kennedy supporter because he released my son from jail." And as a result of that information and a press conference that Dr. King had just thanking President Kennedy, all of a sudden the news went from Atlanta down to Savannah, and from Savannah up to Memphis, and Memphis over to Nashville, Nashville to New York, and Philly, and Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Chicago. And President Kennedy won the election by 112,000 votes because black people got together who could vote and said, "We're going to put this man in office." But then after his assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson became president, but signed the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, and then signed the Voting Rights Bill in 1965. And when those bills were signed, black people again voted as a bloc to say that if you will respect our interest, we'll give you our support. But as a result of those two bills being signed, it changed the political landscape in Chicago. Because of those two bills, a person in 1971 was able to move into the Congress by the name of Ralph Metcalfe. And Ralph Metcalfe mentored a young man by the name of Harold Washington. And because he worked under Ralph Metcalfe, Harold Washington was able to see the formation of the Congressional Black Caucus that Ralph Metcalfe was one of the founders. But then he became mayor in 1983. But watching him was a young man named Jesse Jackson, and said, if he can become mayor, then maybe I can become president. And so then in 84 and 88, Reverend Jackson then registered more black people than anybody in history up until that time. And as a result of that, Ron Brown became the chair of the Democratic National Committee. And because Ron Brown became chair of the Democratic National Committee, they then put offices in every county to ensure that they would organize black people, because in 1992, somebody from Hope, Arkansas decided to run, but he would not become president if it hadn't been for Ron Brown, and it had not been for Jesse Jackson, if it had not been for Harold Washington, if it had not been for Ralph Metcalfe, if it had not been for Dr. King. Don't forget the movement in relationship to the moment that President Obama did not become president out of the air, that we have been working as a people since the moment we arrived on these shores. It is a movement we are a part of. So, before you get excited about Clinton, because Clinton could not be president if it hadn't been for Ron Brown. If it hadn't been, Ron Brown could not be chairman of the Democratic National Committee if it had not been for a Jesse Jackson, and so on. So when people say Clinton went out and got votes for Obama, I say, no, Ron Brown did. Jesse Jackson did. Harold Washington did. Ralph Metcalfe did. Dr. King did. And even in his death, he was able to elect a president. So when one looks at this text, this exile community under Persian control, exiled by Babylonian colonists, Nehemiah serving a Persian king. He gets word that the walls have broken. He is working in a really good government job. as a cupbearer, job with benefits. But God calls him and says, I'm going to break your heart. Because when you see the destruction in your community, you can't sit in your cushy bourgeois job anymore. I'm going to put it upon your heart to do some community organizing, to make sure that you transform the community. And sometimes God will break our hearts in order to motivate our spirit. And Nehemiah's heart was broken because he saw the walls in disarray. The question becomes, when shall brokenness enter your spirit to the point that it motivates you to do something about it? Instead of just becoming numb to the conditions of our community and saying that I must do something about it. But don't just say I'm ready to do something about it. Take Nehemiah's lesson that before you go out to do anything about it, get down on your knees first and say, Lord, I want to come to you because I know that I have participated in the decay in my community. And that is the way that Nehemiah prays. He doesn't say, Lord, fix the walls, do some magic. No. He says, Lord, I know that I've been in Persia so long that I have not spent the time utilizing my resources to change my community, that I am part of this. If you read chapter 1 and you see this prayer is very self-reflective. He goes on to say that, Lord, that I offer myself and I ask for forgiveness from you. And here he is. And he then receives a release, a sabbatical, to go out into his own community and to observe the walls. But here is the first thing I simply want you to know, that if we are to get to work as a community, that Nehemiah gives us a lesson. The first portion in this lesson is this, that there has to be observation. And that you've got to look and see what the problems are. You cannot hide your head in the sand. The walls are broken in the land. The walls that are to keep the enemy out and to keep the children safe are broken in the community. And so therefore it is the role of Nehemiah to say that I want to rebuild the walls, but the walls are broken in our community. Economically, there are walls that are broken. That we save about $5,400 in wealth as a community, but we spend over $1 trillion. That we have to get our house in order. The walls are broken. The walls are broken. Broken because of broken fatherhood. We have robbed our children of fathers. The walls are broken, educational walls, theological walls. But then he does something after observation. He does some organization. He shares his plans with no one. He just takes a few men with him and he shares not only with God what he plans to do. But here is the thing that I love here is that he's not willing to share with the Jews, with the priests, with the nobles, because he knows that if he shares what God placed on his heart, that somebody is going to oppose him. That you cannot share everything that God places on your heart. You've got to keep some of those things close to your heart before you can share it with somebody. And when you share it, you've got to share it with somebody who knows the same God that you know. Because they don't even have the language to understand what you're talking about. You'll say anointing, and they'll be looking for ointment. You'll say healing, they'll be looking for a doctor. You say save, and they'll be looking for a bank. You say deliver, they'll look for FedEx. You say breakthrough, they'll look at the wall because they don't understand the language that you're using. You've got to share your dreams with people who know the same God that you know, who understand what God can do in your life. Don't share your message with people who don't know the same God that you know.